If one is deliberating deliberation, is one not engaged with, in fact, promoting the very viability of deliberation? If we accede to the processes which the title of this panel promotes, and which by extension all or most panels of this conference and academia itself promote, we are acceding to the conceptions of the individual and its relation to the world that deliberation rests upon. Reasoning subjects who can utilize a rationalist perspective to discuss a particular existent object in the world, in this case deliberation, and then compare this object with our reasoned observations of other objects and concepts in order to formulate a structure of thought which is then tested through ongoing reason and observation. In fact, these processes seem natural to us, particularly those of us in the academic world. The effect is that they become naturalized. Both the reasoning subject and the world of pre-existent objects form the unquestioned bases for how we interact with the world. But the question remains, how do we critique these processes and deliberation which rests upon them without utilizing and thus validating the very processes we are attempting to critique? How does one critique deliberation without engaging in the processes of deliberation? What I'm attempting to develop in this paper and in my research is not a critique of any specific aspect of deliberative processes, but rather to in some way decenter the very processes of reason, rationality, etc. that I've discussed and which underlie the deliberative paradigm. In order to construct this kind of critique, I utilize the writings of Nietzsche on aesthetics and will to power. I bring these writings together to form what I call aesthetic judgment. Let me emphasize at this point that this construct, aesthetic judgment, is a term of artifice I utilize to denote my intertwining of Nietzsche's writings on aesthetics and will to power. I am not attempting to connect into the long history of aesthetics or aesthetic judgment such as that offered by Kant. The problem with the current literature on Nietzsche, as I see it, is that the commentaries on Nietzsche's aesthetics and those on will to power often remain divided. The effect is a Nietzsche who, though fascinating in a scholarly way, does not often prove useful when we consider how individuals interact with and move through social space. My contention is that Nietzsche is best understood through social application, and in particular, in comparison to those bodies of thought, such as deliberation, which rely on the very kind of processes which Nietzsche abjures. In terms of will to power, my argument is that much of the literature on Nietzschean will to power tends to view this concept in isolation from other aspects of Nietzsche's thought. The question that is asked is often an ontological one. What is will to power? Read in this way, I would argue, it can be difficult to separate Nietzsche's perspectivism from that of a deliberativist paradigm. While it is often noted that Nietzsche writes a great deal about perspectivism, it should also be noted that deliberativists are also aware of the ways in which differing views represent different ways of life. Joshua Cohn, for example, a deliberativist, writes that there exist, quote, distinct, incompatible understandings of value, unquote. So why is it that while the deliberativists write of cooperation and consensus, Nietzsche writes of multiplicity of forces and relentless enforcement of claims of power? Focusing exclusively on will to power more often provides information as to what will to power is not based on, impartiality, reason, knowledge, etc. Though we might comprehend the thrust of Nietzsche's writings on will to power as a basic psychological drive to assert one's view of the world, the lack of any description of how these views are constituted, how judgments are constructed, makes it very difficult to place will to power in the world of social relations. If individuals are not utilizing reason, if the claim of reason is itself a will to power, then what is Nietzsche substituting for reason? In order to better understand the workings of will to power and the bases through which Nietzschean will to power engages the world, we need, I argue, to intertwine will to power with Nietzschean aesthetics. This intertwining can be difficult, as much of Nietzsche's writings, as well as the commentaries on Nietzschean aesthetics, tend to focus on the physical dimensions of art, Greek drama, for example, and the contrast between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. My view of Nietzschean aesthetics focuses not on art, but rather the artist. It is a conception of the individual as Nietzschean artist, who, and this is a quote from Nietzsche, transforms things until they mirror his power, until they are reflections of his perfection. In Nietzsche, I argue, The shaping and form-giving aspects of will to power are highly aesthetic endeavors. They are the impetus of the individual as artist. Art is action. It is a will to power reshaping of the social world so that the latter resonates with aesthetic perspectives. The will to power aspect of aesthetic judgment tells us that aesthetic interpretations do not function in isolation. Rather, as we traverse the social world, we are often confronted with situations in which there are a majority of individuals with one aesthetic preference and a minority who are drawn to or function best within a different perspective. In these moments, aesthetics and will to power are joined. Individuals disappear, and aesthetic discourses confront one another. The social terrain, I argue, is not comprised of individuals with a majority preference engaged in rational discussion with those in the minority. Rather, there is only a particular aesthetic view of the world confronting a different aesthetic view. For the majority, deliberative outcomes resonate and amplify their own aesthetics. They see themselves as that which they seek, a reasoned collectivity. For the minority, the aesthetic confrontation appears to be a move of power, of unceasing struggle. Reason, consensus, and power are thus highly perspectival aesthetic constructions. There are, I argue, no objective criteria to determine the reasonableness of deliberative outcomes. There is only the juncture or disjuncture between the aesthetic claim of reasoned outcomes and existing aesthetic disposition. Neither disposition, minority or majority, reflects a quote-unquote real world, nor do they possess objective real-world reference. Rather, each is a product of aesthetic inclinations and will to power. To the deliberative majority, the removal of hierarchical power reveals the reasoning individual. To those on the outside of this perspective, there is only the triumph of a collective aesthetic constructing that which it supposedly reveals. I argue in my paper that bringing together seeming disparate bodies of thought, such as deliberation and Nietzsche, requires attentiveness to the performative aspects of theorizing and the often occluded relation between theory and performance. If I was to simply compare the supposed objective constitutive elements of deliberation with those of Nietzsche's writings, or if I was to appeal for justification of either approach to a purported real world whose measurement is the distillation of reasoned observation and argumentation, I would be explicitly claiming and arguing for a theoretical openness to the Nietzschean approach, while performatively I would be utilizing and valorizing the rationalist methodology of deliberation. In order to approach the disruptive effects of the Nietzschean aesthetic, while resisting the demands and strictures of deliberative rationality, I focus not on constitutive elements and ontological approach, on the way deliberative thought, but rather on the way deliberative thought itself performs, the way it responds to different kinds of critiques, rationalist and aesthetic. This performative process also serves to highlight some of the differences between the rational and the aesthetic. I utilize a collection of essays entitled Deliberative Politics, Essays on Democracy and Disagreement, in which various authors critique the seminal text Valorizing Deliberation by Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson, and are responded to in kind. In the first critique I analyze, Ian Shapiro utilizes what I would denote as a rationalist approach to argue that Gutman's and Thompson's text, quote, attends too little to the degree to which moral disagreements in politics are shaped by differences of interest and power. Shapiro claims that, quote, their discussion is not sensitive to the reality that different people are differently bound by collective decisions. Even more specifically, Shapiro is concerned with, quote, decisions by powerful players who make it their business to shape the terms of public debate through the financial contributions they make available to politicians and political campaigns. The tenor of the response by Gutman and Thompson is to embed Shapiro's critique within the processes of deliberation. They do so generally when they write that, quote, if his judgments are worthy of having some influence on political practice, he should be prepared, as deliberative Democrats urge, to justify these judgments to his fellow citizens. And more specifically, their critique of Shapiro, they claim that, quote, deliberating about campaign finance reform, for example, brings to light the power of money in American politics. For Gutman and Thompson, all critiques of deliberation are exercises in deliberative processes. The difficulty for Shapiro is that he accedes to the strategy when he begins his essay by writing of his agreement with Gutman and Thompson that, quote, much of what divides people politically is susceptible to rational analysis more often than people realize. Once Shapiro accedes to the Gutman-Thompson position on the viability of rational analysis, once he agrees that reason can form the basis of political judgment, he has placed himself on the deliberative terrain. Further, Shapiro's critique of deliberation invokes the very kind of disparate power relations deliberation hopes to address. And this allows Gutman and Thompson to easily position Shapiro along their own topography. Criticizing deliberative thought by invoking specific procedural problematics often leaves one open to the response of, we'll have to deliberate about that. The second critique I analyze is that written by Stanley Fish. Fish's approach is very different, as he attempts, I would argue, to position Gutman and Thompson along the plane of aesthetic judgment. He asks, quote, isn't disinterested one more word like impartial and reasonable that claims the high ground of neutrality while performing exclusionary work, end quote? He writes further, quote, a difference of opinion or respect is an opinion held by someone who argues from the same premises and with the same tools you do. An opinion you merely tolerate is an opinion held by someone who argues from premises and with tools you and your friends find provincial at best and dangerous because fanatical at worst. For Fish, Gutman and Thompson must, quote, find a way of dressing up their personal moral judgments so they will appear to have been generated by wholly impersonal mechanisms, a process which Fish deems to be a, quote-unquote, sleight of hand. Gutman's and Thompson's response is again one of repositioning. If Fish attempts to move them onto the aesthetic plane, they will counter by attempting to draw him back onto the terrain of deliberation, to reshape aesthetic claims into rationalist formulations. There are a number of interesting elements to this debate which were not present in the exchange with Shapiro. The Fish-Gutman disagreement, I believe, is much more about the fundamentals of aesthetics versus rationality, and Gutman's and Thompson's efforts to place Fish within the domain of deliberation are more strenuous and strained. Fish's claim is that the terrain of reason and rationality, the constitutive elements of rationality itself, are highly perspectival aesthetic constructions. Gutman and Thompson argue against this on the explicit level, even as they perform precisely what Fish claims. For example, they claim that Fish is engaged in mere self-assertion, writing that, quote, once readers recognize that his rules of argument authorize him to say anything that helps him win, and winning is merely a matter of causing people to accept his views, his arguments dissolve into self-assertion, unquote. Again, that's Gutman and Thompson. But Gutman and Thompson are unwilling to apply this critique self-reflectively, and this appears to engage the very kind of aesthetic mechanism Fish is problematizing. The Fish-Gutman debate appears on the textual level to be a deliberative engagement about a constitutive element of deliberation, in this case rationality, while performatively it displays the incommensurability of differing aesthetic viewpoints. Let me say this in conclusion. In a field of political theory, which is now rife with demands for solutions and prescription, deliberative thought has reshaped the terrain it traverses. The demand for resolutions and solutions can be seen as an aesthetic reaction to the seeming whirl of postmodern thought, which came to the fore in political theory at the end of the last century. Each time there was a critique of the postmodern approach along the lines of, what are you offering as a solution? Nietzschean aesthetic judgments informs us that we should examine the aesthetics of this demand and how it functions within the context of political theory. To attempt to decenter deliberation by analyzing its constituent components, to utilize the real world as an objective standard, is to critique deliberation using the deliberative paintbrush. Through the optic of aesthetic judgment, there is no real of deliberative thought outside of the theoretical context in which it is embedded. In the end, one may simply yearn for chaos, with all its messiness and lack of resolutions, to once again join the battle.